Hey adapters, welcome back. Today our guest is Tonya Graham, the Executive Director of the Geos Institute. Tonya has taken a lead role in developing the concept of whole community resilience, which helps local leaders develop climate resilient solutions that are ecologically sound and socially equitable. Tonya will discuss how communities who already have the practical knowledge to build effective climate resilience plans only need a guide for implementation. She introduces us to the Climate Ready Communities, an assisted do-it-yourself program to help small to mid-sized, under-resourced communities help build climate resilience. Hey, Tonya, welcome to the show.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
All right, so looking forward to this conversation. You are working with on-the-ground communities, but first, let's just learn a little bit more about you and your organization. What is the Geos Institute?
So, the Geos Institute is a nonprofit. We're based in Southwest Oregon, and we work to make sure that communities can adapt to climate change around the country in ways that are, as you mentioned, ecologically sound and socially equitable. We focus on that intersection between science and the experience that people have by being in their communities and running their own community systems. And so that's our main focus. We do, with our ClimateWise program, we do consultant-led processes with communities. So when a community puts out an RFP and goes down that contracting space, we engage there. And then we also have our Climate Ready Communities program for small to mid-sized communities and those with fewer resources.
All right, so how big an organization are you? And you're a nonprofit organization, right? Even though you're working with communities, but I mean, you're nonprofit.
Yes, we're a nonprofit organization, and we've worked in communities pretty much around the country. We started out primarily in the West, but more recently have worked in community in Louisville, Kentucky, and are starting to branch out into countries further, or states and communities further east.
Well, maybe you'll get to some other countries though, right? Like
Oh.
hopefully something like Tahiti or something. But so let's talk about you just briefly. And you've been doing this for a while, but what's your background? How did you get into this space where you're working on adaptation and resilience?
Yeah. So initially, I was with an organization called Headwaters in Oregon, and that organization focused on forest and water conservation. And in 2006 or so, we did a merger with another organization that was working on those same issues. And in that process, really started to look at what is the impact of climate change on ecological systems. And so we had been pulling out dams for years and replacing irrigation pumps and that sort of thing to return rivers to their free-flowing state. But then when we looked at climate change, we realized that with drought conditions coming and water being more scarce, potentially harder to predict, that it was likely that we might go back and we might lose all that work that we had done. And in that process, we realized how important it is, the decisions that local governments make. So as they're responding to climate change, what they do is going to really matter on the side of the environment. And so that's really what got me into the field, and we started in 2008 working with communities to help them understand what those impacts were going to be, and then help them figure out what are the best investments for them to make in order to protect what they care about.
Okay, so you work in an area, and in my introduction of your organization, when you talk about resilience, you're talking about it being ecologically sound and socially equitable. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure. Yeah, I think the assumption that we had coming in initially from the natural systems focused side was that people were already at the table. So in these decision-making processes, the people were there, and the piece that was missing were the natural systems. And what we learned, and I think it's within this field, the field has been having this conversation now for many years about who are the people who aren't at the table either. Right? So who are the people who have been left out of investment in their community? They've been left out of decision-making processes. They've suffered decades or even hundreds of years of oppressive policies in their in federal, state, local government. And what we saw with our initial projects is the same thing, I think, that we're seeing in adaptation practitioners are seeing everywhere, and that is that the people who are the most vulnerable are also the people who tend to have the least resources to bring to bear on the conversation and to deal with those vulnerabilities. And it's through that conversation that our perspective widened. And now we developed a program or a framework we call whole community resilience. And it's built on those twin pillars of ecological sustainability and social equity. So now they have sort of equal play in our view of how this type of work should be done. But when we started, we were really coming in from that natural resources side.
We were chatting a little bit before this episode started, just our backgrounds focusing more on natural systems and such. And so to me, the climate justice, the environmental justice side of adaptation resilience has really come into its own, I think, in the last 5-10 years. I look back and I think when I first started, you didn't hear it that much, and maybe it was implied. But it's been a nice development. But I wonder, and I think we'll get into this talking about climate-ready communities, is the ecological side. In some ways, I wonder if that's being kind of pushed to the side a little bit when you think about the built environment. And I hope I'm encouraged by your approach. I'm assuming you're bringing all those together. But what are your thoughts in that respect? Because as more of the built environment gets into adaptation, the ecological considerations might not be front and center.
Well, that's exactly the reason why we need to make sure that the natural systems are front and center, because what we know is that impacts from climate change happen simultaneous across built systems, across communities, across natural systems. And so those natural systems are already going to be dealing with impacts. And so if the decisions that we make add more stress, then we have bigger problems. If the decisions that we make are nature-based solutions that actually help, they help restore the system, or they help that system hold its integrity together, then those are very positive strategies. And that's really the point of whole community resilience, is what is the impact holistically that climate change is having on this community? And that means all the people, and it means the natural systems. And when we take a look at that in an integrated way, we can create solutions that are good across the community, across those different systems. But if we segment it, if we go for it in a siloed way, where we just look at this particular piece or just look at that particular piece, that's when we start to create solutions that actually cause problems to other systems while they're also dealing with climate change. And that, to me, is the crux of it, is we have to take this holistic look so that we can make the best investments.
Okay, maybe we could talk about it a little bit later, but the whole notion of maladaptation is just, it blows up the whole idea of holistic approach, right? And people aren't, I guess, giving enough attention to maladaptation. But listen, let's just jump right into climate-ready communities. I mean, you've sort of talked about what it is, but what is it really?
So climate-ready communities is an assisted do-it-yourself program that we've created to help small to mid-sized communities, basically up to 250,000 people. We use that to help them build and implement climate resilience plans. And so, in 2016 or so, we stepped back and looked at the field and looked at what was happening across the country. And it was pretty clear that adaptation and resilience planning was happening in really large cities and in progressive, wealthier, smaller communities that could afford to hire someone at $75,000 or $100,000 to come and help them with a plan. Yet all of the projects that we had done showed us that the people who needed that work and that help the most were often the same people who didn't have the resources to either pay a consultant or the technical staff to figure it out on their own. And there are many manuals out there. There's no shortage of manuals about how to do planning in the climate adaptation space, but they don't have phone numbers. There's nowhere to call if you get stuck. And they're very technical. A lot of them tend to be very technically written. And so it's intimidating, on top of just the intimidation of doing climate planning in lots of communities where it's controversial. So we took a look at that, and because we're a nonprofit and our goal and our mission is really to serve the broader community, we decided that what we wanted to do was to create tools and resources that would help those communities that we saw being left behind, where that gap was really growing between their ability to get out in front of these impacts and the impacts themselves. And so the program is set up, it's based off of our practical guide to building climate resilience. And that is structured off of our whole community resilience planning process. So we essentially wrote down everything we had learned about how to help communities plan for climate change, step by step, giving guidance depending on what kind of a community somebody's working in. They may want to do this step one way, or they may want to do it a different way. There's a lot of flexibility for the local government or the local organization that's doing it to figure out what's the best way to do this particular step in my community. But the steps are laid out with a variety of ways that they can accomplish them. And we also included in that guide any free resources we knew about in the field. So for instance, when it's time to do engagement work, we send them over to Climate Access to access their free resources that they have. And so the idea was a community could do this entirely on their own, as best we could make it happen with this guide. And alongside of it, though, we recognized that they might get stuck, they might need some more help. There's particular places in a planning process where it is easy to get stuck and they might need some more help. And so we've developed a suite of support system services for folks who are moving through the guide. And those include, we've got a portal, so they can pay a fee to have access to the portal, helps them track their progress, gives them some additional tutorials and templates and access to our video webinar library. And then aside from that, any community that's using the guide can also purchase a certain, they can purchase blocks of consulting time. They can have us develop their climate projections for them if that's what they need. They can hire us to come out and facilitate workshops or help them write their reports. It's really kind of an a la carte menu that they can move themselves through, taking advantage of their own capacity wherever they can and reaching out and accessing ours and our consultant networks whenever they run into something that they need some help getting around.
So
that's it in a nutshell.
Well, how many communities have you worked with so far?
So we were just finishing up we were sort of coming around the horn on our pilot process when COVID hit. So we worked with communities to do beta testing and pilot testing. And just as COVID was coming into play, we had our first two communities come through the program. And so Climate Ready Missoula is a good example of a plan that was completed using this process, and it's for Missoula County, Montana. And the other community was Corinth, Texas, and they completed theirs over the summer. The other one, as is the case, I think, for many places, local government has been completely focused on COVID, and understandably so. And so our hope is that as we come out of COVID, that those communities will start to pick up and pick up and start moving again with their process. It actually, the COVID question, I think, brings to light just the reality, the financial reality now of local communities is even more so that they probably are not going to be able to afford to do significant contracts for consultant-led processes. So,
have you been monitoring even the stimulus, even as we speak? It sounds like it might be passed, and I think in this version, there's actually a big chunk of money for local governments to, I guess, fill in some of their holes. Do you see potential opportunities where they're just like, okay, well, now we could do some of these things, do resilience planning? Have you been able to monitor that at all?
Yeah, it's been something that's been put forward in all of the stimulus conversations and has been cut out of everyone up until this point. So it's still vulnerable, but it will certainly help. And the question that remains is, how would it be structured? So in many places, I think it will be backfilling budgets, which doesn't necessarily give them new money to work with, but at least it doesn't, it doesn't put a community in the place where the cuts have to be so drastic that any sort of climate planning is simply off the table, right? If we can just get communities back to the place they were at before COVID, then that's a gain in terms of them being able to focus on climate resilience. We're talking to communities and they're laying off planners, they're laying off people that are really necessary in this type of planning process. So keeping local government whole at this point is critically important on the climate resilience side of the world.
And that was, I guess, my follow-up question too, is that, okay, post-COVID, or even, I know it's early days for this particular program, but what is an ideal situation? Because you have the do-it-yourself, the templates, all of it there. But as you know, it's like you sort of need key people within a community. Is it the top of the leadership? Is it a mayor that's saying we need to do this, or is it sort of an ambitious urban planner or a sustainability officer? You must be able to kind of sniff out like, all right, this city is going to probably have a better shot of getting something done because they've sort of have this set up. What are some of those, I guess, metrics of what a community should be set up to be successful?
Right. That's a great question. And one of the things that we look for is the community really actually ready to do its planning, or does it need to have that earlier conversation? And sometimes climate projections can help with that earlier conversation because they can show the community this is where we're heading in terms of the impacts. And now, which is it's different than it was just 5 or 10 years ago, now people are actually seeing those things. They're seeing increased heat problems. They're seeing storms changing in their behavior. They're seeing wildfire happening in a different way than they've seen in the past. But they need to be ready to move into that planning process. There absolutely has to be support at the elected official level. There needs to be at least a champion that can help those decisions move forward at local government. And there also needs to be supportive staff and community members. And what we've seen is it doesn't take a lot of them, but it does take a number of folks who are willing to go out and have those conversations and get their community ready for this planning process, so that once they do start to invest staff time and community resources into this work, even if it's just staff time, that it's the right timing and it's ripe essentially for that community to do its work.
Okay, I got a question from the community room here from Sarah. Could this program be applied at the regional level for communities who want to work together on a resilience plan? So I guess issues of scale.
Yes, that is a fantastic question. And in fact, what we've been doing during COVID is we've been starting to work with cohorts of communities. So we have an Oregon cohort that has started, and we're in conversations in several other states with folks about starting up cohorts there. But that regional question is very important, and we can even think about it in terms of counties as well. So if a county goes through its process and engages the municipalities within it in a county-wide process, then those municipalities can actually start with the county plan and bring that into their municipality. They don't each have to do all of that work themselves. So working at the county level or even at a larger regional effort absolutely works with this. And then the municipalities that are within that region can build on it and say, what is it that's specific to us from this plan that we should incorporate? What are things that might be different in our community that didn't get picked up in that larger regional effort or that county level plan that we need to address locally? And that is actually, I think, the model. The best way to do this work is to start at that little bit higher level so that each of those smaller communities can build off of the work that's already been done.
I don't know if you've dug into it much, but the executive orders from President Biden around climate change, there's the designation of a climate task force, and there was even a climate, like AmeriCorps, but a climate corps. And it seems like, a ripe opportunity that if you have all these people out in these different communities that they're partnering up with, because I'm sure even if 24 cities approached you, you have a capacity issue. I know that's a do-it-yourself, but there's still some hand-holding to get people started and such. But it just seems like there's a lot of stars aligning potentially to get people out in these communities to help with the kind of work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the capacity issue is a really important part of this, because do-it-yourself, of course, means that you have to do it yourself, or primarily some amount of it you have to do yourself. And especially when you get into smaller communities, you have people who are doing 4 or 5 different jobs, and their plates are completely full. And so it is interesting that when you look at the potential for the climate corps and those sorts of folks, one side of it is, are they just going and doing sort of hands-on, on-the-ground work, or are they being also placed in communities to help with planning? And that's my hope. We see examples like Civic Spark in California, where they dispatch folks for 10 months or 12 months, that sort of thing, and they're coming out of college, they've got some skills, they're able to really bring additional capacity to these processes. And that's one of those elements that I think is critically important, is how do we bring through the work that we're doing with our young people, how do we bring more capacity for doing this actual planning so that they can get their strategies mainstreamed into their systems and they can revisit them from time to time. But that first lift does need some additional capacity.
I'm curious. In a lot of the climate planning that's going on now is sort of reaction to disasters and disaster mitigation. How does that come into play? I mean, with resilience and adaptation, sometimes there's more of kind of future thinking and you're being thoughtful for long-term planning, but then there's a lot of communities that are just like, help us plan better for floods, and okay, throw in climate change on top of it. Does that influence, template design and sort of the how you communicate with these different communities?
Yeah, it does, especially because the motivation to do this planning, as you say, is often related to something that they've just experienced. So in my hometown, we had a massive fire come through last September, and what happens in the wake of those is, of course, the major focus is that particular disaster and avoiding that particular disaster. So sometimes that larger climate piece is harder to work around, and there's urgency to it. They want answers quickly, and this process that we have takes some time. That holistic look takes some time. So there's always some tension there if a community has just experienced a particular natural disaster. On the other hand, it can be hard to motivate a community that hasn't experienced that, right? So because it's always a future issue that they have to deal with, and so that's really where the balance is. And sometimes a process like what we do through Climate Ready Communities is best done after the initial recovery has happened from that last disaster. Right, so you've got to get people housed. You've got to deal with that emergency for the first year or so before people can feel settled enough to dig into something that's deeper and that's going to take a little bit longer to get to the other side of.
Well,
but it's increasingly the problem that we have to deal with.
The examples that you've worked in the community so far, it hasn't come up, but I am in the manual itself. Is sea level rise something that you've been able to kind of really embed there? Because that would be an interesting sort of case study of one of those communities, because that really is much longer term. You might have hurricanes or whatever, but like, how do you get a community really thinking long term in sea level rise? Has that popped up in some of your early thinking in the design of the manual?
Yes, actually, and in terms of identifying vulnerabilities, community vulnerabilities, that's really where that conversation comes up. So we have communities take a look at the changes that are coming. So they get their projections from wherever they get them, and they are looking across their community as what does this mean? So if it's a farming community, they're looking at their agricultural products and what they make, and can they grow this in those future conditions? That's a long-term element. Sea level rise is another one. Where are we putting our infrastructure? What are the things that we might need to change? If our rivers are becoming flashier and the floods are getting larger, what does that mean for our land use codes and our development? And so each community is going to come up with their own vulnerabilities based on what their economy is driven by, how they've settled their landscape, where they happen to be, and what risks they're under, what hazards are coming into play in their particular area. But the framework that we've put together allows those communities to do that at a very custom level. So we don't come in and say, here are all your issues, here's what we think. It's here's the process for thinking about these things that you take your community through. And then you can figure out where you want to invest your money, your time, your local government resources into dealing with it.
Okay, so we're getting toward the end of this interview here. And I guess one other area, again, I haven't dug into the manual as much as I should have, but you're giving them all these skills. They're doing it themselves. But how does communication, is that part of it? Is like communicating to the public about what they're doing? Is that something that you've built into that approach?
Absolutely, and we actually build it into each of the steps. So the very first thing that they will be doing is setting their scope and then having those early stakeholder conversations in their community. It goes all the way through the process, because what we know is that community engagement is critical not only for building the plan, but for getting it implemented. Because at some point, the community will be asked to invest something, whether that's money, whether that's inconvenience, whether that's zoning restrictions. They're going to be asked to make some changes. And if they don't understand why the changes need to happen, and if they haven't been involved and had the opportunity to help shape it, then often the support isn't there to actually do the implementation. So public engagement and really honest and meaningful feedback loops is a critical part of that. And so we have a focus on it all the way through.
Okay, so if a community, and I know COVID is just impacting everything, but if someone from a community, an urban planner is like, all right, I want more about this, obviously they can go to their website, but what advice would you give them to learn more and maybe to initiate doing something with you?
So the very first thing that we always encourage folks to do is to download our practical guide to building climate resilience. And it's available no charge on our Climate Ready Communities website. And reading through that, they can get a sense of whether this is the process that will work for their community. And if it does, we tell them, just get started. Get started. And if you run into trouble, if you run into questions, if you have obstacles that you're not sure how to get around, then we can help you. Just, there's a variety of different things that you can access here that can help you get around whatever your issue is that shows up. But get started. That's the most important thing, is to start now. Sometimes people think they have to wait for data or they have to wait for more clarity and all that sort of thing. And that's just not true anymore. What needs to happen is for people to start that process and get it moving, get those conversations happening in their community. And then we are here to help, and so are the folks with our consulting network.
Okay, great. And what's next for you? What's your next 3 to 6 months like?
Well, right now we have been in conversations with folks in DC around what are the things that the federal government should be investing in terms of the new administration. And certainly what we've been advocating for are certain anchor elements that the federal government can help us put in place around science, around strategy databases, and around financing. And so that's what we've been most heavily involved with. And then we're looking to, as COVID releases, to start to really put more focus again on the ground. We've had over 600 people download the guide so far, and different communities. And so we're going to be following back up with them, seeing where they are, seeing what kind of help they need.
Oh, I'd love to see a geographic range of those downloads, just see where the interest is. You don't have to tell me right now, but okay, Tonya, this has been great. You guys are doing some really important work, and I think that, again, the stars are aligning with the change in administration, hopefully with some investment and funding going out there. Hopefully you're going to be even more demand than you're capable of giving, in the next 2 to 5 years, that there's just going to just be a new push for this. So you're set up well. But I want to bring you into just chatting, but thank you so much for what you're doing. Thanks for coming on Simpatico.
Thank you, Doug. It's been great.
All right, just a sec.